Hi folks, I'm really confused, but I have a request for you. It's my mom's birthday today, and she asked me to tell you to subscribe. Please subscribe, she will be pleased. In the meantime, I will tell you about a few dates that I found on Reddit. After my marriage ended, I was in a tough spot financially. I was working part-time as a server, and I had an apartment that I couldn't afford. It wasn't fancy or anything, but I didn't make enough to keep up with the rent. Anyway, I started using Tinder to meet new people around that time. I had used it in the past. In fact, that's how I met my first husband. I was at home swiping on the app one evening, and nobody really caught my eye. Maybe I was being too picky, or maybe I wasn't over my ex yet. After a while though, an interesting profile came up. His name was Jay, and he was actually a few years younger than me. Normally, I'm interested in older guys, not too much older, but I'd never dated anyone younger before. I cycled through each of his pictures a few times. They showed him in different locations. One was a white sand beach, another was in New York City, and there was even one image of Jay where it looked like he was in front of a private jet. I know I sound shallow, but that's the truth about what made him stand out. That wasn't the only reason I was interested. It was just what made him stand out initially. I swiped right on Jay, which was the only right swipe I had done so far. Then I put my phone away and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I opened my phone and saw that I had a match on Tinder. I knew it was Jay because that's the only one I had accepted. I opened my messages and saw that he had contacted me already. All he said was hi. That's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to contact me, then try to say a little more than that. I let it slide this time though, and we started to have a conversation. After no more than 5 or 10 messages each way, Jay asked me out on a date. I accepted, and we made plans for the following Friday night. We went out to a really nice restaurant, way fancier than what I would have suggested. He was a slightly awkward guy. I can't really put my finger on why. We had an all right conversation, but there were more uncomfortable silences than I'm used to. It was a first date though, and first dates can be awkward. When the bill came, I was a little nervous that Jay would want to split the cost for the night. I didn't know how much it would be, but I knew that I couldn't afford it. That's why I was relieved when Jay grabbed the bill from the table without hesitation. After that, we parted ways, and I headed home on the bus. Jay and I went out another few times over the following weeks. Like before, we always had a pretty good time. There was something off about him though. It was like he was trying too hard to impress me. It was clear that he had money, and he wasn't afraid to spend it on me. Things were getting more and more extravagant. He took me on a river cruise on the weekend. It must have been at least a few thousand total. All that for a woman who wasn't even his girlfriend yet. I don't mean to sound unappreciative, but it did seem like a bit of a red flag. Things came to a head when Jay texted me and invited me on a trip to Mexico. Although tempting, I wasn't ready to make that kind of step. I felt bad, but I broke things off with him through text message. After that, my phone rang, and it was Jay. I answered it, and was immediately bombarded with the most vile, hate-filled insults I'd ever heard. This guy was mad. I'd never seen this side of him before. While we were dating, Jay was a really polite and shy type of guy. I held the phone up to my ear for a minute or two, and the screaming didn't stop. So I eventually hung up the phone and turned it off. I was scared. I didn't know what this guy was capable of. He also knew where I lived because he dropped me off at my apartment once or twice before. The next morning, I turned on my phone, and there were dozens of missed calls and tons of messages from Jay. I don't remember the exact content of the messages, but they were filled with the same insults as before. I didn't reply for the next few days, but eventually I decided to call him and try to smooth things over. He picked up the phone and started screaming at me like before. I tried to calm him down for a minute or so, but it was useless. He even said that I had to pay him back for all the dates we'd been on. I was in no position financially to do that, so I hung up again. I went to work the next night. I was working nights as a server at the time, and my mind was on Jay the whole evening. I was worried that he'd come for me for the money or worse. I got off at around 1:00 a.m. and took the bus home. When I got to my front door, my heart sank. The door was wide open. I took a cautious step inside, and as soon as I did, I knew someone had been there. My mind went immediately to Jay. I called out hello, but there was no response. I walked through the place, fear flowing through my body. When I got to my bedroom, I noticed something on my bed. It was a piece of paper. I picked it up and turned it over. There was a message written on it that said, "You're dead." That was enough. I ran out of there and didn't go back. I went to my friend's place that night and called the police. They were able to arrest Jay with my testimony, as well as the evidence that they were able to gather from my apartment. After the police interrogated Jay, they found out that he was flat broke and that he was paying for our dates with borrowed money on several credit cards. I was really confused about that for a while, but when I saw a documentary on Netflix, it started to make sense. In the documentary, a guy used Tinder to sweep women off their feet with expensive gifts and dates. Then he would trick them into paying him back by borrowing money, and then he would promise to pay them back, but never would. My relationship with Jay never got that far, but I suspect it was leading there. That would explain why he wanted me to pay him back. After that, I never heard from him again, and I'm more careful about who I meet online. This reminds me of an old saying that my grandfather used to use. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Several years back, perhaps around 5, I encountered a man on Tinder, which led to the most frightening experience I've ever had. We had been exchanging messages for a few days when he suggested we go out on a date. Though I was anxious, I agreed, ensuring that our meeting spot would be a bustling cafe in the heart of the city to prioritize safety when getting to know new people. Since I didn't own a car at the time, I took a bus to our rendezvous point, a journey that lasted about 30 minutes. Arriving roughly 10 minutes ahead of schedule, I waited outside the cafe. Within a couple of minutes, a man named Jack walked up to me. Upon seeing him in person for the first time, I was relieved. He was tall with wide shoulders and resembled his photos, if not slightly more attractive. We instantly connected and spent the next 2 hours engaged in lively conversation, laughing and enjoying each other's company. Unbeknownst to us, the coffee shop had closed during our engaging exchange. As we exited the cafe, Jack offered to give me a lift home. Though I hesitated briefly, I ultimately agreed, feeling a sense of familiarity and comfort with him. We continued conversing as he drove, and I was genuinely enjoying myself. Unfortunately, it was at this moment when I let my guard down that everything took a dramatic turn for the worse. While driving along a busy road, we saw the flashing lights of a police car behind us. Jack muttered a curse under his breath and began to accelerate. My heart raced with panic as I wondered why he would attempt to evade the police. Despite my frantic pleas for him to stop, he disregarded my request, and the police pursuit ensued. The blaring sirens grew louder, and I realized we were in deep trouble. As Jack made a sharp turn, the tires screeched against the pavement. We ultimately collided with a fence, bringing the car to an abrupt halt. The fear I felt was immense, as I had never been involved in a car accident before. I wasn't sure if I had sustained any injuries. Within moments, 2 police officers appeared, guns drawn, and aimed at us. Jack tried to exit the car, but the officers yelled at him to remain inside. Overwhelmed with terror and tears, I couldn't fathom what I had gotten myself into. The police officers proceeded to handcuff both of us and placed us into separate vehicles. I could see Jack speaking to one of the officers, but I couldn't make out the conversation. After a few more minutes, the officers approached me and informed me that Jack was a wanted criminal. He had been on the run, and the car we were in had been stolen. The realization that I had been on a date with a criminal left me feeling nauseous and desperate to return home. The officers escorted me to the police station, where I recounted my version of events. After completing the necessary formalities, they arranged for a taxi to take me back to my apartment. Sleep eluded me that night as I repeatedly went over the evening's events in my head, attempting to comprehend what had transpired. I had placed my trust in Jack, only to discover that he was a dangerous individual. My ability to discern whom to trust was shaken to its core. It took a considerable amount of time for me to come to terms with the ordeal. Initially, I felt deceived and angry with myself for not recognizing the warning signs. However, I eventually understood that I couldn't hold myself responsible. Jack had lied to me and put my life at risk. In retrospect, I acknowledge how fortunate I was to have emerged from the situation unscathed. Things could have been far worse. The experience taught me an invaluable lesson about exercising caution when dealing with strangers, particularly those I encounter online. In early 2017, I was using a couple of popular dating apps, but I was mainly focusing on Tinder. After going through a string of average dates, I was almost ready to quit, but then I matched with someone who seemed promising. Her name was Leela. Her profile instantly grabbed my attention, and I really hoped we'd match when I swiped right on her. She seemed like a fun and interesting individual based on her profile. To my surprise, we matched. Our chat started off pretty smoothly, and it seemed like we had a lot in common. We were really connecting. We agreed to meet for our first date at a nearby park where we could decide what to do next. On the day of our date, I sent her a message to make sure we were still on. She replied immediately, confirming that she would meet me there at 7:30 p.m. The meeting spot was the large gate at the park's entrance. I arrived there, looking around the crowd, hoping to see Lila. Just when I was about to text her, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Leela asking to meet at a different location, a few blocks away. It was an ordinary street corner. I wondered why she would want to meet there instead of coming to the park, but I agreed and started walking. It was only a few minutes away. As I moved towards the new spot, excitement was building up within me. I wasn't bothered by the change in plan, assuming she had found a better place to meet. But as soon as I arrived at the corner where we were supposed to meet, I received another text from Leela. She wanted to meet at yet another location, this time even farther. Even though it was a bit inconvenient, I wanted to meet her badly, so I agreed and headed to the new location. But when I reached the third location, a strange feeling came over me. It was essentially an alley sandwiched between two apartment buildings. There weren't any people around as far as I could see. That place had a dangerous vibe to it. My gut was telling me something was off, but curiosity got the better of me, and I kept exploring. At this point, I was doubtful if Lila was even real, but I couldn't let go of the hope that she was. I know, not a smart move. Out of nowhere, I noticed two guys walking toward me. They were dressed in dark clothes, jeans, and black hoodies. They were also sporting surgical masks and sunglasses. I attempted to flee the other way, but there was another big guy approaching from that direction, effectively trapping me in the alley. He was dressed similarly to the other two, just more imposing. I looked around for an escape route. The only way out seemed to be a door on one of the buildings, but it was locked. I desperately rattled the doorknob for a few moments before turning around. I was surrounded. The three guys stood motionless in front of me. Then one of them spoke. "Give us your wallet." and phone or else. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I felt so foolish. Despite knowing something was off, I walked right into their trap. I didn't try to negotiate. I simply handed over my wallet and phone. Before leaving, one of them threatened me, saying they would kill me if I reported them to the police. I believed him. After they left, I cautiously returned to the main street. It was already dark. I scanned the area, making sure those guys weren't nearby. The last thing I wanted was to encounter them again. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly walked home, constantly looking over my shoulder. Back at home, I considered contacting the police, but the threat made by one of them made me hesitant. Those guys really terrified me. I was also filled with embarrassment. I wanted to forget the whole incident and move on. In hindsight, I realized I should have reported the incident to warn others, but I didn't. In fact, I never shared this incident with anyone until now. It's a relief to finally let it all out. When I was younger, I used to spend a lot of time on dating apps. Luckily, I don't need them now. I actually met my wife on Cupid, but this story is about a not-so-great encounter I had on Tinder. This happened about 5 years ago. I was on the lookout for love, or at least something that felt real and significant. One lucky night, I was going through Tinder profiles, and I matched with a girl. Her name was Lisa, and her profile was quite fascinating. She had actually taken the time to fill out her profile, which I really liked. The pictures on her profile were also good, but they weren't unrealistically perfect like some profiles I'd seen. It seemed like a lot of profiles were fake. I bet it's worse now, but it was still a problem back then. I initiated the conversation, and we exchanged some messages. We seemed to get along well from the start. Lisa seemed smart, funny, and she liked a lot of the same things I did. We hit it off and decided to meet up. She suggested a local pub in our city. It was quite a ways away from my place, but I agreed anyway. The day came, and I went to the pub feeling a bit anxious. She was a blonde with green eyes. I looked around the room trying to spot her amongst the few people there. As I turned around as she was at the door, she looked exactly like her profile pictures. I walked over to her with a smile. She smiled back, and we got a table and ordered some drinks. We chatted effortlessly, and it felt like we had a real connection. It felt like we'd known each other for a while. I was quite excited that the date was going so well. Time flew as we laughed, talked, and exchanged stories. After about an hour, Lisa suggested we head to her place to continue our date. I was surprised. I've never been one to go to someone's place on the first date, but I couldn't say no, so I agreed. We left the pub and started walking. She said her apartment was just a 10-minute walk away. When we got to her apartment, I noticed that the building was unusually quiet. It was an old building, probably from the 70s. The corridor smelled musty, and it seemed like more than half of the lights weren't working. The walls were stained, and the hallway carpet was worn out in the middle. There were several big holes in the carpet too. The situation was a bit unnerving, but I couldn't fault Lisa for it. City rent can be a nightmare, and many buildings are not up to par. To be fair, my own apartment wasn't much better back then. With this thought, I followed her into the apartment, hoping it wasn't a big deal. As soon as we stepped inside, I could detect a faint smell that was hard to identify. It was different from the hallway scent. I assumed she had pets. Perhaps she had a cat, and its litter box needed changing. The smell was a bit off-putting, but it wasn't terrible enough to make me leave. Lisa and I settled on her living room couch. We opened a bottle of wine and continued our conversation. Nothing significant occurred initially, but about 30 minutes in, the door opened. I figured it was a roommate or something. She hadn't mentioned if she lived alone. A few moments later, a tall man appeared before us. He looked mad. He was about my age, but was a towering 6'4" with a long brown beard and a backwards baseball cap. It didn't take much to figure out who he was. I immediately knew he was her boyfriend. I glanced at Lisa, and she was in tears. When I looked back at the guy, he was shouting at me to get out. I didn't hang around. I hurriedly put on my shoes and headed towards the door. I was out of there in less than 10 seconds. I practically sprinted down the corridor and out of the building, looking over my shoulder every now and then. Luckily, no one was following. I caught a bus home, still rattled from the adrenaline rush. I couldn't believe what had just transpired. It seemed like Lisa was trying to use me to either get back at her boyfriend or make him jealous. She must have planned for him to catch us. It was a really underhanded move, not just towards me, but also towards him. There's no telling what he could have done to me. In a way, I was fortunate he let me go. I promptly unmatched Lisa and took a break from dating apps for a while. I really should have reported her for her actions, but I just wanted to put the whole thing behind me. I never saw or heard from her again, and luckily, all of my subsequent experiences with dating apps have been much more positive. The story I'm about to share is true. It totally changed how I think about dating and meeting people online. But let me first tell you a little about me. I'm a 22-year-old woman who drives trucks for a living. I'm a lesbian. I like my outfits a bit loose, and I keep my hair short and neat. Even though I'm still young, I've experienced a lot of wild situations. There have been times when I had to brandish a knife to defend myself, and I've broken up fights with full-grown men. I've seen some stuff. All this started when I was 18. That was when I began questioning my sexuality and wondering what it would be like to be with a guy. Until that point, I'd only been with women, and I was single and curious, if you catch my drift. To explore these feelings, I turned to the internet and downloaded an app named Meet Me, hoping to find someone who I might be attracted to. The app was filled with weirdos and too many inappropriate photos until I stumbled upon a guy. Let's call him Joe. Joe and I started chatting, and he seemed cool, relaxed, and pretty adventurous. After a few days of getting to know each other, he suggested we meet up. I agreed, but looking back, I wish I'd never downloaded that app. We planned to hang out at his place, eat some food, play video games, just relax. I know what you're probably thinking. It sounds dangerous and naive, like the plot of a thriller movie. But I was young and eager to experience new things, so I went all in. I went to his house at night. It was nice. We chatted for a while, had some pizza, and after a while, things escalated, and we ended up sleeping together. Once everything settled down, we were just lying there enjoying the moment when I heard a scream. I was startled and asked Joe, "I thought you said we were alone. What's happening?" He replied that his brother might have come home and turned on a movie. He went to check it out. I was left in his room half-dressed, hastily gathering my stuff, prepared for any possible scenario. He came back. Joe was surprised and asked why I was packing. Weren't we having fun? I was confused and slightly scared. The scream had felt too genuine and too near to be from a TV. The story I'm about to share is true. It totally changed how I think about dating and meeting people online. But let me first tell you a little about me. I'm a 22-year-old woman who drives trucks for a living. I'm a lesbian. I like my outfits a bit loose, and I keep my hair short and neat. Even though I'm still young, I've experienced a lot of wild situations. There have been times when I had to brandish a knife to defend myself, and I've broken up fights with full-grown men. I've seen some stuff. All this started when I was 18. That was when I began questioning my sexuality and wondering what it would be like to be with a guy. Until that point, I'd only been with women, and I was single and curious, if you catch my drift. To explore these feelings, I turned to the internet and downloaded an app named Meet Me, hoping to find someone who I might be attracted to. The app was filled with weirdos and too many inappropriate photos until I stumbled upon a guy. Let's call him James. James and I started chatting, and he seemed cool, relaxed, and pretty adventurous. After a few days of getting to know each other, he suggested we meet up. I agreed, but looking back, I wish I'd never downloaded that app. We planned to hang out at his place, eat some food, play video games, just relax. I know what you're probably thinking. It sounds dangerous and naive, like the plot of a thriller movie. But I was young and eager to experience new things, so I went all in. I went to his house at night. It was nice. We chatted for a while, had some pizza, and after a while, things escalated, and we ended up sleeping together. Once everything settled down, we were just lying there enjoying the moment when I heard a scream. I was startled and asked James, "I thought you said we were alone. What's happening?" He replied that his brother might have come home and turned on a movie. He went to check it out. I was left in his room half-dressed, hastily gathering my stuff, prepared for any possible scenario. He came back. Joe was surprised and asked why I was packing. Weren't we having fun? I was confused and slightly scared. The scream had felt too genuine and too near to be from a TV. So I came up with an excuse. I told him I got a text from my dad and needed to head home. He was wondering where I was, and I had told him I was on my way back. "Okay, let me walk you out," he said. He escorted me to the door, and we said our goodnights. You're probably wondering why I didn't contact the police. Well, I didn't have to until 2 days later. That's when I saw on the news that Joe and his brother had been keeping their stepmother captive, starved and tortured, for 2 weeks. They had released him for a doctor's appointment, and he had immediately reported to the police. That was when they were arrested. I broke down crying. I realized I could have ended up like that old man, drugged and restrained. The outcome could have been a lot worse if I had stayed longer. So James, I hope you're rotting in jail, and I hope you stay there for a long, long time. I had managed to avoid using dating apps for a long time, but I was having a hard time finding a decent guy at bars and clubs, so I decided to give it a try. One night while scrolling through Tinder, I came across a profile that caught my eye. His name was Pat, and he seemed like a real nice guy. We talked for a while and decided to meet up for a drink. I gave him my address, and he said he'd pick me up at around 7. I put on a nice dress and waited nervously for him to arrive. As I stood outside my apartment building, I saw a car pull up. It was a beat-up old truck. I wondered if it was really him, but when it pulled up in front of my building, I knew it was Pat. He was tall with short blonde hair and a patchy beard. He wore a plaid shirt and jeans and had a smile that lit up his face. He walked over to me and gave me a big hug. I felt a little awkward but also a little excited. We got into his truck, and he asked me if I was hungry. I told him I wasn't, but he said that he knew a great place for drinks. It was a little out of our town, but he promised it would be worth it. I hesitated for a moment, but he seemed so charming and persuasive that I eventually agreed. As we drove out of the town, I noticed the scenery changing. Buildings became fewer and farther between, and the trees got thicker. I began to feel a little worried, but I tried to tell myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I'd only just met this guy. When we arrived at the bar, I realized it was not the kind of place I was used to. It was small and dingy and smelled of stale beer. There were only a few other people there, and they all turned to look at us when we walked in. I felt even more out of place. Pat ordered us drinks and tried to get me a shot, but I declined. He kept insisting though, and I eventually gave in. I thought it might make me relax a little. As we sat there talking, All Pat seemed to do was brag about himself. He talked about all the fights that he'd been in and how he once saved a kid from drowning. I tried to listen and nod along, but I really thought he was full of it. I didn't think he was really the kind of guy I wanted to be with. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more scared. There was no cell service, and I was in the middle of nowhere with a guy I barely knew. Pat kept trying to get me to drink more, but I started to feel sick. I told him I wanted to leave, but he wouldn't take me. He said that we were having a good time, and that I shouldn't spoil it. But I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I made up an excuse and said that I needed to get home. I told him I had an early morning meeting and needed to get some rest. He seemed reluctant, but finally agreed to take me back to my apartment. As we drove back, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then Pat started to get angry. He said that I was wasting his time and that he'd driven me all the way there for nothing. I felt my heart racing as he pulled over to the side of the road. He turned to me and said, "Just get out then. I'm not taking you any further." I got out of the truck and started walking down the road. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. I heard him yelling at me as he drove away, but I didn't respond. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I just kept walking. As I walked, I felt the cold night air on my skin. I was shivering, and my feet were starting to hurt. I realized I had no idea where I was, and I didn't have any way to call for help. My phone still wasn't working. I felt like I was in a nightmare. I couldn't believe I'd been so foolish to trust this guy. I felt like I'd put myself in danger, and I didn't know how to get out of it. After walking for almost an hour, I saw a car approaching. I stuck out my thumb and prayed that they would stop. The car slowed down, and I saw an older couple inside. They asked me if I needed a ride, and I almost started crying with relief. They took me to the nearest town and dropped me off at a gas station. I went inside and called a friend to come pick me up. I didn't tell her the whole story, but I told her enough so that she would know that I really needed help. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed and cried. I couldn't believe what happened. I felt like I'd been so stupid to trust a stranger. After that night, I never spoke to Pat again. I deleted his number and blocked him. It took me a while to get over that experience, but I eventually did. I learned from it and grew from it. I promised myself I would never put myself in that kind of situation again. Now, whenever I go on a date, I'm more cautious. I make sure to meet up in a public place where there are lots of other people. I'd always wanted to be a model since I was really young. Growing up, I was always told that I was pretty and had the perfect body for it. I had long legs and a slim figure, and I knew I would look good on camera. So I started posting pictures of myself on Instagram, hoping that someone would notice me. I'd grown a following of a few thousand, posting mostly selfies that were admittedly not very professional. I wasn't taking it seriously, but I was hoping that something would come of it. I received a message from a talent agency. They said they'd seen my pictures and were interested in meeting me. I was over the moon with excitement. I checked out their profile, and it seemed legit. They were a well-established agency with a real website and everything. They gave me the address to their office and told me to come in for a meeting. I imagined the office would be in a big building. However, when I arrived there, I was surprised to find that it was just an apartment complex. I stood there staring at the building for a moment, wondering if I'd made a mistake. I sent a message to the agent, letting them know I was there. They replied almost instantly and told me to go in. I hesitated for a second, but then I thought about what it could do for my career. I put aside my worries and entered the building. As I walked into the building, I felt nervous. The lobby was clean and well lit, but it was eerily quiet. There was no receptionist, no sign of anyone else in the building. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the button for the floor that the agency was on. When I arrived at the floor, I stepped out of the elevator and looked both ways. It was just like any other apartment hallway. It definitely wasn't an office building. I timidly walked to number 56, which was the unit that they gave me. It was a plain white door, just like all the others in the hall. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. After a moment, I heard a voice from inside the room telling me to come in. I pushed the door open, and I was greeted by a large man. He was wearing a suit and had a friendly smile on his face. "Hello, we spoke through Instagram. Please come in and take a seat," he said. I took a few cautious steps inside and looked around the room. I saw that it was just an apartment. There was no desk or anything. It was literally just a guy's apartment. I was about to get out of there. The vibe was way off. I took a step back and thanked the man for his time. Then I told him that I needed to leave. He looked surprised as I walked towards the door. He walked over and held it closed. "Is something wrong?" he asked, a strange glint in his eyes. I was pretty much in panic mode at that point. The friendly smile was gone, and he seemed more menacing than before. I tried to open the door, but he grabbed my arm, and I felt his grip tighten. "It's all good, just take a seat," he said, his voice low and threatening. I tried to pull away, but his grip was way too strong. I looked around the room, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing, certainly not that I could reach. That was when I heard a set of footsteps outside in the hallway. I figured it must be one of the neighbors. I took the opportunity and let out my loudest and highest scream. When I did that, the man released my arm. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I sprinted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the elevator. I ran past an older man when I was in the hallway. He must have been the neighbor that I heard. I hit the button repeatedly, praying it would come quickly. When the doors finally opened, I went inside and hit the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, I burst out crying. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd come here with so much hope, only to be met with danger. When I reached the lobby, I ran out of the building onto the street, and I didn't stop until I was far away in a crowded area where I felt safe. I sat down on a bench and caught my breath. I realized how naive I had been. I'd been so desperate for this opportunity that I hadn't stopped to think about the dangers I put myself in. I was lucky to have gotten away. I did eventually call the police. It turned out that the Instagram page was fake. The talent agency was real, but the guy had nothing to do with them. The man was arrested, and I later found out that he was being investigated for doing similar things to other women. I never found out what happened to them, but I hope they were as lucky as me. As I stepped off the plane at JFK, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. I'd never been to New York City before, but I was there for a work conference. In the days leading up to my trip, I had downloaded the Tinder app and swiped through countless profiles until I found a match. Her name was Tracy, and she was a student at NYU. We hit it off immediately and quickly made plans to meet up. She suggested that we watch the sun set in Central Park, and I agreed. I was really happy to have a local to hang out with, because I wouldn't have known what the good things were to do. As I made my way to the park, I felt a sense of awe at the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. The noise and energy of the city were like nothing I'd ever experienced before. But as I entered the park, the chaos of the city fell away and was replaced by peaceful sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I spotted Tracy sitting on a bench near the lake, her long brown hair blowing in the wind. As I approached her, she looked up and smiled. I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. We spent the next hour watching the sunset, talking and laughing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to walk around the park. We strolled through the winding paths, marveling at the scenery. It reminded me of every romantic comedy movie I had ever seen. The night was cool and quiet, and the park seemed almost magical. As we walked, we talked about everything and nothing. Our conversation flowed easily, and I felt like I had known her for years. We stopped to take some pictures, and as I held my phone up, I saw a man approaching us. Before I could react, he walked up to us, brandishing a gun. "Give me your wallets and your phones," he said, his voice gruff and threatening. Tracy and I froze and started shaking. I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't. I could feel cold sweat beating on my forehead. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. My hand was still shaking. Tracy did the same, her eyes wide with fear. The man took our wallets and phones and then fled into the night, leaving us standing there alone and terrified. We stood there for a few minutes, too shocked and scared to move. Eventually, we'd made our way back to the hotel, both of us shaken and traumatized. We called the police right away. The next few days were a blur of police reports and canceled credit cards. I reported my phone stolen, which is supposed to render it useless to thieves. They probably have a way around that, though. But I did it anyway. It was a really horrible experience, and I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to return to New York City again. I'd never been mugged before. It's not that common where I come from. Tracy and I kept in touch over the next few weeks, talking on the phone and texting each other. I haven't been back since, and it's been over a year. Tracy and I haven't talked in a while, and I'm sure she's moved on. I don't know if this is the scariest experience of all time. Some of you have probably been through worse, but it was really scary for me. This happened last year when I was single. I'm a 27-year-old woman, but I was 26 at the time. I had just downloaded the dating app Tinder, but I was just trying it out. I didn't have any intention to actually meet somebody at the time. I would open it once a day and read a few profiles. By read, I mean look at pictures because hardly anybody actually writes anything. I didn't actually match with anyone because I didn't swipe right one single time. I was just there to observe. There was one guy who seemed to pop up almost every time I signed in. His name was Joe. He was a clean-cut guy, a little overweight, and probably 6 feet tall if I had to guess. I think Tinder has a paid feature where they will show your profile repeatedly, so maybe he had that. It didn't matter to me though. I just kept swiping left to say not interested. One time, I was out walking my dog in a park near my apartment, and I saw a guy walking towards me on a gravel path. As he got closer, he nodded politely, and I did the same. Something about the guy seemed familiar. It took me a few minutes of thinking, but eventually, I realized that it was Joe from Tinder. Not a big deal, I thought. We do live in a big city, so the chances of running into him were small but not unbelievable. Over the next few weeks, I seemed to run into Joe a few too many times, and it became creepy. I began to suspect that I might have a stalker. One evening, I was in my room getting ready for bed when I looked out my window and saw a pair of eyes looking back at me. Someone was looking in through my window. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, so it would have taken some effort to climb up there. As soon as we made eye contact, he disappeared. I went over to the window and looked out. I saw a man running away. I could only see him from behind, but I'm pretty sure that it was Joe. I called the police immediately. They suggested that I stay with a friend for the night, which I did. The next day, we went to the police station to file a report. I actually didn't have any way to contact Joe since we never met online or otherwise. What we ended up doing was actually pretty creative. When I was discussing with the investigator, I opened the Tinder app and simply swiped until Joe's profile came up. When it did, I told them that that was him. The police placed a restraining order on Joe, and I'm glad to say that we've not crossed paths since. I'm a 23-year-old woman, and I started using the dating app Hinge a while ago. I had tried a few of the other apps with little success, but I heard from a friend that this one was supposed to be better. I took her word for it and set up a profile. While it wasn't long before I started getting matches, one of my matches was Chris. He was a year older than me with brown hair and kind of an artistic-looking style, thick glasses with a beard. We had a pretty good conversation one night, and because of that, we decided to meet up in real life. There was a bar that I'd been to a few times with friends, and we agreed to go there. It wasn't my main spot. You should never bring online dates to your favorite places just in case. I was a little late, so when I got there, Chris was standing at the front waiting. We went in and actually had a pretty good time. Chris was a little socially awkward, but it wasn't that bad. I actually found him kind of cute. We had a few drinks and talked for about 2 hours. Then we went our separate ways, and I headed home. Over the next few weeks, Chris would text me sporadically. I would say once every 2 or 3 days on average. He would go hours or even days without replying, and that's a big red flag for me. So I eventually just stopped answering him. I figured he wasn't ready for something like that. No hard feelings, I thought. Fast forward to a few weeks later, and I was at home bored when I got a notification on my phone. It was Chris. I was surprised to hear from him, but slightly in a positive way. He asked me if I wanted to hang out that night, and like I said, I was bored, so I agreed. This time, I gave him my address so he could pick me up. Half an hour later, he pulled up in front of my building. He had a blue Honda Civic with a large dent in the rear bumper. I got in, and as soon as I did, the mood felt off. Like I mentioned before, he was kind of an awkward guy, but this time, he hardly said a word. I immediately regretted my decision to get into a car with this guy. I decided that as soon as we stopped, I would make an excuse and get out of there. We were going to a different bar this time, and as soon as Chris parked the car, I faked an important call and said I had to leave. I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't believe me, but I turned around and walked away, and he didn't try to stop me. When I was on the bus, I blocked and deleted Chris from Hinge and blocked his number on my phone as well. He didn't do anything that bad, just gave me a weird feeling. It's hard to explain, it just felt off. However, if that was the end of it, then this wouldn't be a very scary story. Over the coming days, Chris sent me a friend request on Facebook and also followed me on Instagram. I was starting to feel creeped out, so I blocked him on both apps. A few days went by, and nothing really happened. However, eventually, I started seeing some things that really scared me. I started to see his car parked on the street near my work, and even near my apartment building. The dent in the bumper was a dead giveaway. It started to seem like he was stalking me. A few weeks went by, and I kept seeing the car now and then, but I never saw Chris. However, that would eventually change. One evening, I was coming home late from work. I was walking down the sidewalk. It was dark, and for reasons I can't explain, a chill ran down my spine. That was when I looked across the street and saw Chris's car. It was a very quiet night. The street was almost completely empty, so I was feeling very vulnerable just then. I was grabbed from behind. A man's arm was wrapped around me. It was Chris. We struggled for what seemed like a long time, but it was probably only a few seconds. It was soon obvious that I could not overpower him. So I did the one thing that I could think to do. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, and I didn't stop. Eventually, the noise must have been enough to draw some attention to us, because a few people came out onto the street from one of the nearby apartment buildings. As soon as that happened, Chris took off. I called the police that night and told them the whole story. Fortunately, I wrote down Chris's license plate number, so it was not difficult to track him down. Legal charges are still pending against him for what he did, but I was given a restraining order pretty much overnight. There were many warning signs for what eventually happened. Looking back, I feel that I should have called the police as soon as I started seeing his car parked in my neighborhood. Signs like that should never be ignored, and I almost paid a horrible price because of it. I'm Ryan, and I'm a 26-year-old guy, but this happened a few years ago when I was 25. I had been using online dating apps for about 6 months at the time. Like most people, I was skeptical at first. My biggest fear was that I would go to meet a girl, and it would end up being some group of guys playing a prank. So my biggest fear was humiliation. This story, however, is not about humiliation. What happened to me was much worse. I matched with a girl named Katie on the dating app Bumble. She was my age with blonde hair and a few tattoos, which was just my type. After we sent a few messages back and forth, I asked her to meet in real life. She agreed, and I sent her my number. Normally, I like to take our communication off the app as soon as possible, since it feels a little more personal when you have a person's number. However, she didn't text me and continued using Bumble's Messenger. I figured she just wanted to make sure I was real before giving out any personal information. I respected that and didn't push the issue. Katie suggested that we meet at a small bar in the downtown area. It was walking distance from my apartment, so it was perfect for me. I set out on foot and arrived about 10 minutes early. When I got to the bar, I noticed that it was closed. It was a Tuesday evening, so not exactly the busiest time for bars. I opened the app and sent Katie a message saying that I was there and that the bar was closed. She replied and suggested another place down the street from this one. She also told me that there was a shortcut through a park. I agreed to go to the other place and started walking. While I made my way down the sidewalk, I checked my messages to see if there was any update from Katie. I had a message from her saying that she was there waiting and that I should hurry and cut through the park. I agreed and started walking faster. It was 8:00 p.m. and the sun was down. So when I got to the park, it was almost pitch dark. The small path going through was unlit. Therefore, I didn't really feel comfortable walking through there. Instead, I started jogging on the sidewalk so I wouldn't leave my date waiting more than I needed to. When I made it to the bar, I was exhausted from running. I stood outside for a minute on the sidewalk before going in so I could cool down and catch my breath. I took this time to check my messages again, but when I looked at Bumble, I was shocked to see that Katie had blocked me. I stared at my phone, still breathing heavily. I was confused. Why would she delete me right before our date? Once I was ready, I went into the bar. I figured it was a mistake, so I could just find her, and then we would exchange information if things went well. I went in and walked around the bar for a few minutes, but Katie was nowhere to be found. The place was small, and she definitely was not there. That was when I started to connect the dots. She was leading me into a trap. She had most likely suggested the first place because she knew it would be closed. Then she could lead me into the park, which was on the way to this place. I figured there was some kind of ambush waiting for me. Luckily, when I got there, I knew it didn't feel right, although at the time, I wasn't sure why. She must have deleted me when she realized that the plan had failed. Although I was disappointed and definitely creeped out by this incident, I realized that it could have turned out a lot worse. Whenever you meet people online, always make sure to follow your intuition and don't do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Although I still believe that most people are good, there are some out there who mean to do you harm. Just for some background, I'm an 18-year-old male currently living in New York. I'm 6'4" and muscular. I've always been one of the larger kids in my class, and I look old for my age. I stopped growing in 9th grade, which was 4 years ago, so that should give you an idea of what I mean. I was that kid in the 8th grade who could already grow a full beard. There's one of us in every school. This happened last month, just after my 18th birthday. I was lonely after a breakup with my girlfriend of 7 months, and I was looking for a rebound, so I turned to Tinder. I set up a profile with my real pictures and lied about my age, saying I was 24. I matched with a gorgeous girl. She was almost too good to be true, but I went with it anyway. We exchanged a few innocent messages and planned to meet at her place the next day at 9:00 p.m. I wasn't as excited as you might think. I had my doubts about whether she was real or not. The next day, as the time approached 9:00 p.m., I was getting ready to go over to her place. Before I left, I texted my dad, saying that I was going to a friend's house. I asked my good friend James, who is 6 years my senior, to drive me since I didn't have a car. He drove me to her apartment, and I rang the doorbell. I heard light footsteps behind the door and a high-pitched voice saying, "Be right there." That's when I texted James, telling him that everything was fine and that he could leave. As soon as the door opened, I felt a tremendous sense of relief because I was face to face with the girl from the pictures. Unfortunately, that feeling would be short-lived. As soon as I entered, she promptly asked me if I wanted a drink. I politely declined, which caused a noticeable change in her demeanor. This set off a red flag, and I became suspicious of her intentions. Realizing that I might be in trouble, I asked to use the bathroom to give me a chance to contact my friend. She obliged eagerly. I entered the bathroom and quickly texted James for a ride. Looking up from my phone, I could barely make out what looked like a dark figure behind the shower curtain. Before I was sure what I was seeing, the figure pounced out like a cat, and I found myself in a wrestling match with this mysterious man. I was absolutely terrified, even though I was much larger than him. He was probably 5'10", 165 pounds and bald. He seemed to be in his mid-30s. I was 6'4" and 210 pounds. Once I got my wits about me, I was able to overpower him easily. I took him to the ground and punched him in the face 2 or 3 times. After that, James texted me to tell me that he was waiting outside the building. Just then, the girl barged into the bathroom and started screaming. I ran past her and got out of that apartment. When I got into the car, I frantically explained to him what had happened. It only then hit me that I could have been drugged, mugged, or worse. I took screenshots of her profile and all the messages between us. Even though I'd gathered all that evidence, there was still little that the police could do since it was just my word against theirs. I got away from this one with little more than a scare. The moral of the story is that you always meet in a public place for a first date. Probably the second two, just to be safe. I worked at a small ice cream shop when I was in my early 20s. That's where I met one of my best friends, Melanie. She was 1 year younger than me. I was kind of like a big sister to her. We always tried to have our shifts together, which were usually in the evenings since the more senior workers got the day shifts. The place had a few busy periods throughout the night, usually when the movie ends. There was a large movie theater nearby, and that was the main source of customers. We would use that time to gossip and discuss our personal lives. I had a steady boyfriend at the time, and we'd been together since high school, so I didn't have any experience with dating apps. Melanie, on the other hand, was on several different apps. She was around 5'8", with short blonde hair and slightly plus-sized. She used Tinder mostly and would often show me her matches and the cringy openers that they would send her. We were standing behind the counter at the shop, huddled around her phone, giggling. She then showed me a new match of hers and the conversation that they'd started. His name was Troy, and he was 27 years old. Troy had longish black hair, a short beard, and glasses. He was actually really good looking, almost like a model. My first impression was that it might be fake, but I didn't want to be a downer, so I kept my mouth shut. Melanie then told me that they were planning to go on their first date the following night. I wished her luck. Then she put away her phone, and we finished our shift for the night. I gave her a call the following night at around 11:00 p.m. to see how the date went. She didn't answer, which I took as a good sign. Then I went to bed. Melanie and I had a shift together the next night, and I was excited to find out how the date went. When I got to work though, Melanie was nowhere to be found. It was not like her to be late, so I called her phone, but there was no answer. I didn't have her parents' number, so I really didn't know what to do. I waited at the shop for about half an hour, and then I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. When I talked to the officer, I found out that Melanie had been reported missing by her mother the night before. She never came back from the date. Several weeks went by, and nobody heard anything from Melanie. I continued to work at the shop, but it was incredibly difficult without her. I couldn't get my mind off of her. I was in close contact with her mother, and I was frustrated with the police, who hadn't made any progress in the case. It had been over 2 weeks, and no arrests were made, so I was frustrated. Another week went by, and there was still no word about Melanie. By then, I was beyond frustrated. I had to do something, so I came up with a plan. I set up a profile on Tinder and uploaded some of my cutest photos. I remembered the face of the guy who Melanie went out with that night. I had no idea if the pictures I saw were real, but I had to try. I opened the app and started swiping. I swiped left to pass on each and every profile. I was only concerned with finding the guy who took Melanie out that night. It took an hour or so, but eventually I found what looked like the guy. It said his name was Chad, although I'm pretty sure it was Troy. Before I looked through the profile for a minute, and then I swiped right. Once I did that, I put my phone away and tried to take my mind off of it. Later that day, I opened the app, and I saw that I had a message from him. I felt a combination of disgust and excitement. This could be the key to finding out what happened to my friend. I replied to his message, and I'm embarrassed to say that what I typed was very provocative. I needed this guy to be interested. After a few more messages, Chad asked me out on a date, which I accepted eagerly. The next night, we met for drinks at a small bar on the other side of town. I had trouble holding back tears when I saw him sitting at a table in a far corner of the dingy room. He looked just like his pictures, which was actually surprising to me. I sat down and put on my best forced smile, but it almost caused me to dry heave. We talked for about an hour. I didn't bring up Melanie, even though it was big news in the area. As I sat there looking at this guy, I wondered what he knew. He really gave me the creeps, and I strongly suspected that he had something to do with whatever happened to Melanie. I contemplated my next step. The plan was simply to get in touch with the guy, and to be honest, I didn't expect it to work. Now that I was there, I really didn't know what to do. I kept talking to Chad until eventually he asked me to come back to his place. I politely declined, and then I quickly excused myself. I got up and walked out of that place as fast as I could. When I got to the street, I dialed 911. I got a hold of the detective on Melanie's case, and I explained what happened. I told him what I did, and I thought this guy was responsible for Melanie's disappearance. To my relief, the officer believed me and took it seriously. I gave Chad's information to them, and they promised to look into it. A week later, I heard that Chad was arrested and confessed to accidentally killing Melanie. He even led them to her body. I still work at the ice cream shop, but I never fully got over what happened to my friend. There's some closure in learning the truth, but it's still tough. I started using Tinder a while ago, and it's been okay. I'd always wanted to meet somebody the old-fashioned way, but my work schedule was really busy, so I finally decided to give it a try. It was around the year 2015, so Tinder was fairly new at the time. After I set up my profile, I started swiping. I was surprised by how many matches I got. It was actually only 3 or 4, but that's still more than I was expecting. One of them was Tanya. She was absolutely gorgeous with long curly hair. We hit it off right away, and after a few days of chatting, we agreed to meet at a park near my apartment. On the day of our date, I arrived at the park early. It was a nice day. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze was blowing through the trees. The park was quiet, with just a few families and couples scattered around. I found a bench near to the spot where we were going to meet. As the minutes ticked by, I became anxious. It was past the time that we agreed on. I checked my phone every few seconds, wondering if she had canceled or gotten lost. As the sun began to set, I started to worry that I'd been stood up. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. A long shadow appeared, cast by the late-day sun. I turned to see 3 guys approaching me. They were all around 25 years old, and 2 of them were really large. I felt nervous as they got closer and tried to brace myself for what was about to happen. "Hey man, how's it going?" one of the guys said. "Fine," I replied. "Can you spare a few bucks?" Another of them asked. "Sorry, I don't have any change," I told him. I stood up to walk away, but 2 of the guys blocked me. Then one of them said, "Can I see your wallet?" I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. "I don't want any trouble," I said, starting to realize what was happening. I tried to squeeze past them again, but they didn't back down. Instead, they moved closer, and one of them grabbed me by the arm. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. The other 2 guys circled around me, and they looked really intimidating. I knew I had to act fast. Fueled by adrenaline, I swung my free arm and managed to connect with one of the guys. He stumbled back, clutching his nose, and the other 2 guys paused for a moment. I caught them by surprise. That's when I made a run for it. I darted away from them as fast as I could. I looked back every few steps. I could see them chasing me, but I was clearly the faster runner. I just kept going. When I finally stopped, panting and grasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. I was in a part of the city that I'd never been before, with no landmarks to guide me. I checked my phone to figure out where I was and how to get back to my apartment. I looked up a map and finally found my bearings. I called an Uber because I didn't want to risk walking home and having those guys find me. I was really embarrassed about what happened, and I tried to play it off like it was nothing. It wasn't until I got home that I started crying. After I had the chance to calm down, I checked my phone. By then, I was pretty sure that Tanya wasn't real. I figured those guys made a fake profile to lure me into a trap. It wasn't the smartest scam, really, because I actually only had $20 or $30 in cash, and they didn't even get that. When I opened the Tinder app, I was surprised to see a new message from Tanya. It said something like this: "Hey, sorry I missed you. I had a family emergency and had to take my dad to the hospital." At first, I didn't know what to think. Was this a genuine message, or was she trying to throw me off? Maybe that guy was mad I punched him, and he wanted revenge. I decided to reply just to see what she would say. I asked her what happened. Tanya replied a few minutes later, "It's a long story. My dad had a heart attack and had to go to the hospital. It was really intense. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't believe it for 1 second. There was no way that it was anyone but those 3 men. I didn't call her out directly on the off chance that it was real. I simply unmatched her and moved on with my life. I was way too embarrassed to call the police. I didn't know how they could find those guys anyway, because I didn't have any real information for them. That was pretty much the end of it. However, a few months later, I was walking down the street near my place, and I'm pretty sure I saw one of those guys step off the bus. He didn't notice me. It was pretty creepy to think that those guys are out there. I keep thinking of how awkward it would be if I ran into one of them at the grocery store or the gym. When all of this began, I was just shy of my 23rd birthday. I want to make clear that I was a completely different person back then. Over time, I've become less hard-headed. When I was 22, I met a man on the internet. Let's just call him Guy. He was 40 when we first started chatting. I didn't realize at the time that someone his age could be as different as he was. I used to think he was pretty cool, and we quickly became close friends. That's how I felt, at least. He was a good listener and would tell me all sorts of random tales. The way he expressed himself was always a bit odd. His way of talking was as if we were in a live-action game of Dungeons and Dragons. We messaged each other every day. Back then, I was dating someone, and this guy even became friends with my boyfriend. Then, for about a year, we stopped communicating. One day, out of the blue, he sent me a text. He said he'd lost all his contacts except for mine. For some reason, he sent me a picture of my contact details on his phone. It was a photo I had previously sent him, but I didn't think much of it then. Our friendship seemed to pick up right where it left off. He was going through a divorce at the time, and I was his shoulder to lean on. That's how he put it. He stated that there were certain boundaries he didn't want to cross, and so we started having regular phone chats. He began to hint that he wanted my help in spying on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Since she wouldn't recognize me, he was overly eager to find out who she was living with. This was the first warning sign that I actually acknowledged as such. Someone warned me that he was a bit off, and that I should avoid him, but what did I do? I kept talking to the guy, despite being told not to. Again, he mentioned the boundaries that he didn't want to cross. The second warning sign was related to religion, Scientology. He never tried to make me join, but he always wanted me to accompany him for moral support during audits and the like. I always turned him down. Once again, my friend warned me to stay clear of him, but I didn't pay heed. Soon, Guy wanted to meet in person. I tried to decline as diplomatically as I could, making up reasons like being busy. Eventually, however, I caved and sent him my location. I need to emphasize again that he claimed we were just friends, and there were boundaries he wouldn't cross. I agreed to this, but unlike him, I actually meant it. He turned up at my place on his scooter. I'm a fairly tall woman at 5'7", and this man, now 42, was a whole foot shorter than me. The first thing he did was forcefully kiss me. When I managed to get free from this unwanted kiss, he studied my face and commented, "I just wanted to make sure you were real," as if my presence in the driveway wasn't proof enough. I felt really uncomfortable, but since I was at my parents' house, I felt safe enough. He tried to convince me to ride on his scooter with him, but I repeatedly declined. Then my little sister, who was 17 at the time, came outside. He immediately befriended her and convinced her to go for a ride. She agreed, so he took her around the neighborhood and brought her back. At this point, I decided it was time for him to leave. We still maintained contact, but he started to become very controlling, despite the fact that I was still dating someone else. Then he began asking for my younger sister's phone number, discussing what he'd like to do with both of us. I really wanted to cut contact with him, but by then I was too afraid since I had given him my address. and he knew where my younger sister lived. Finally, after he had bombarded my phone with messages for days, with me responding perhaps every 20th text, I finally blocked him. Then he started texting my boyfriend, asking about my whereabouts. He was insisting on getting my little sister's number, even claiming that I had agreed to give it to him, which was an outright lie. With the messaging app I was using, if you blocked someone, you could still see the messages they sent, but they didn't trigger notifications and didn't show up in your regular text inbox. He sent me 2 lengthy messages, one in English and the other in Spanish, each spanning about 15 pages. He continued to spam my phone and that of my then boyfriend for months on end. Finally, he just vanished. I'm now 28, and fortunately, I haven't heard from him since. I've definitely learned that red flags are there for a reason. And if your instincts tell you to keep your distance, you should listen.